Welcome back to our How to Play for I, Napoleon, a card-driven game from GMT Games that allows you to live out the life of one of history's greatest figures, Napoleon Bonaparte. In this video, we're going to cover the two main segments of the game. The card action phase, in which you determine what happens in that year of Napoleon's life by drawing cards, and the campaign resolution phase, where you determine Napoleon's fate on campaign and on the battlefield. And let's be honest, that's really what you're playing the game to do. So let's start with the card action phase. At the highest level, during each round in the card action phase, you're going to draw a card and do what the card tells you to do. Sometimes it'll be good, sometimes not. After you deal with the cards you just drew, you have a chance to look for cards that are on the board that have triggered effects and trigger them now. We'll talk more about what that means in a moment, but you can do that at this point. Then you increment the card draw marker, and that's counting how many cards you've played this year. After you've drawn 5 cards, you're going to start checking by rolling a die to see if each card is the last one that you draw that year. You roll the die and you compare it to the range listed in the box that the marker is moving into. You never know how long or how short a year will be in terms of how many cards you draw. So let's dive into the specifics. The first one is easy. You draw a card. Now, you're going to look at the text in the card's main section, paying careful attention to the when revealed instructions. If the card's when revealed instructions include the word may, then that card is not mandatory. So let's start, however, by talking about mandatory cards. Some mandatory cards are pretty simple, and they're just going to tell you to do something like adjust a resource value, in this case plus 2p. Or they may tell you to roll a die, get a result, and then implement the effects of that result. In this case, no effect or plus 5g. Or they may tell you to place the card in a location box. Or they can tell you to place the card in a location box and do something. So in this case, you place this in current treaties and you set Prussia to neutral. But there are times when you'll draw a mandatory card and you won't actually be able to play it. And that's mainly for one of two reasons. The first is it has a cost and you're unable to pay that cost. So this card is mandatory, but you have to pay 1 political point to remove it from play. Now, if you don't have 1 political point, then you are unable to pay the cost of this card. The other possibility is that a card has a prerequisite that has to be met in order for it to be played. In this case, the campaign location box must be empty in order for you to play this card. So for mandatory cards, if you can pay the cost, you have to pay the cost and play the card whether you want to or not. If you can't pay the costs, you discard the card and you draw a new card to replace it. In terms of mandatory cards with prerequisites, if you meet the prerequisites, you must play the card. Otherwise, you discard it, but you don't draw a card to replace it unless, as in this case, the card itself specifically tells you to replace it. And just to be clear, when I say you draw a new card to replace the discarded card, you do that without incrementing the card draw marker. That's what that means. If the card is not mandatory, you still have to check whether you meet the prerequisites or pay the costs. If you can't do either of those, you discard the card, and in either case, it counts as your card draw. So in this case, you're going to move on to the next step of this phase, and you will increment the card draw marker to draw when you draw a new card. If you meet the prerequisites or you're able to pay the costs, you get to decide what to do with non-mandatory cards. You can play it, in which case you simply do what the card tells you to do. So for example, here I'm going to place lands in the commander's box. Over here, commander's location box. But if you don't want to, you can simply discard the card, or you simply ignore it. In this case, you don't draw a replacement and you continue moving through this phase. So now let's talk about actually playing the card. As you'd expect, if you play the card, whether by choice or because you have to, you're going to read the card's when revealed instructions and execute whatever actions it describes. When revealed instructions are typically going to tell you to do one or more of the following. Place the card in a location box. Adjust resource points. Adjust diplomatic status. In this case, it also includes placing it in a location box. Let's set Prussia to neutral. Choose between options. Now, in this case, as we mentioned, as with costs, you have to be able to pay the costs. So if I don't have a political point, I can't choose the first option. And if I don't have 5 glory, I can't choose the second option. But in this case, since we just got a couple of political points, we'll take the first option. Minus 1p and plus 5g. Or it will tell you to roll a die and check the results. One last note I'll throw in here is that when a card tells you that you have to lose a certain amount of a resource, whether that's as the result of a die roll or whether that's just a part of the when revealed instructions, you lose as much of it as you can, but you don't go below 0. Many cards also include effects, and typically any card that you place in a location box will have an effect that becomes active once it's placed there. Effects typically only affect a specific phase of the game, so a habit you need to get into is scanning the board for cards that might have an effect when you're, for example, resolving a campaign or making a diplomatic or domestic politics roll. So let's talk about the types of effects you'll typically find on cards and what they impact. Campaign or combat effects have an impact during the campaign resolution phase, which we'll cover in detail in just a minute. Some effects are active during all rounds of combat, some only during specific rounds. Some of them may change the result of a round of combat. At any rate, look for campaign or combat effects during when you're doing campaign resolution and apply them as appropriate. Ongoing effects are active until the card is removed, and you'll notice a special icon on the card in that top left, as well as a banner down towards the bottom that indicates that it has an ongoing effect. It's important at many points in the game to scan the map for ongoing effects that could impact something that's going on. But some examples of these, in this case, this is an ongoing campaign effect. So as long as this is in the Prussia box, you treat the first victory in campaigns against Prussia as a stalemate. If this card's ongoing effect is a -1 DRM on Austrian diplomatic rolls. This treaty's ongoing effect is Spain remains allied until this card is removed by Bayonne or Spain rises. Now, specific subtype of ongoing effect is the income effects, and you remember we talked about this earlier. But income cards are the cards you're looking for. Cards with income effects are the cards you're looking for when you're doing the income resource segment, when you're totaling up how many diplomatic, political, and admin points you're going to have to spend every single turn, and whether or not you're going to lose some glory because of some cards that are out on the board. Triggered effects usually occur in reaction to the play of another card or a change in game state, or provide an action that can be triggered at the will of the player. For example, Tsar Alexander has a triggered effect where France can get a +1 DRM in the first combat round for the first campaign involving Russia after this card enters play. Or you can trigger this effect to discard the card and get an extra admin point. Joseph Fouché, who costs you glory every turn when he's the Minister of Police, you can actually spend an admin point to fire him, which flips him face down, and then you don't end up losing that glory every turn, but you also don't get the 1 political point he provides you. One last thing I'll mention is always be on the lookout for cards that are removed when they're played. So if you play this card, when it has that symbol, you immediately remove it from play. So you just kind of put it off to the side and it never goes back into the deck. The other thing to be on the lookout for is cards which cause other cards to be removed from play. In this case, you're going to remove card 106, Secret Intelligence, from play. Now, typically what I do with these cards is I'll kind of put them here near the draw pile. And if that card happens to come up during this year, I'll kind of remove it, treat it as not having been played, and draw a replacement card in its place. And then during the year start phase, I can go through the deck and find it and remove it at that point. But that way I don't have to like interrupt the turn to go find that card and remove it from play. So you've drawn a card, determined what options you have, and made decisions. The card's played or discarded, and you don't have to draw a replacement. Now you have the existing card play segment, and during this you get to scan the board for any cards that are in location boxes which have triggered effects, and you can choose to play any of those cards that are eligible, which basically just means that their prerequisites are met or their cost can be paid. So for example, we could, at this point, as we discussed, we could pay 1A and flip this card face over. Or in this case, we could discard this card, move it over to the discard pile, and we would get an additional admin point for that card. Finally, you determine whether the year ends or whether it continues with drawing another card. You look at the space that the card draw marker is about to move into, and if it doesn't have a DR listed on it, you simply move the marker and then you go back to drawing a new card. So that means that you will always draw 5 cards before it's possible for the year to end. But if the space it's about to move into has a DR listed on it, you're going to roll a die, and if you roll inside of that listed range, so in the case of the 6th card, a 1, then a 1 to a 2, then a 1, 2, or a 3. If you roll inside the listed range, the year is over and you proceed to campaign resolution. Otherwise, you advance the card draw marker, and draw a new card. Now, once the card draw marker reaches this 12 space, if you get all the way down there, the turn ends, so you'll never draw more than 12 cards. One reminder for the gamblers among you, if you don't like what you rolled here, you can spend Napoleon's Luck to re-roll. Before we finish our discussion of the card action phase, I wanted to go through some of the types of cards that you'll encounter quite frequently, talk about what they are and what you do with them. The first is campaigns. Now, I will mention that you will only draw campaigns during the CMD era. During FCD and EMD, as we talked about, you pick campaigns during the diplomacy segment. But if you draw one of these during CMD, you place it in the campaign location box. Now, the campaign location box is unique. Every other location box in the game can have as many cards in it as you need. This box can only have 1. So if there's already a card in it, as we already mentioned, you would discard the campaign and draw a new card as a replacement. And campaign cards are often gonna have campaign effects that apply to that campaign, but they'll always have a campaign result, which will tell you what happens in the case of generally victory or defeat in that campaign. We'll cover that when we do campaign resolution. Next up is commanders. Commanders are incredibly important in I, Napoleon. They are the main source of positive die roll modifiers when you're doing campaign resolution. All of them are typically optional to play, but there isn't ever really a good reason not to play them. But when you draw a commander, you place it in the commander's location box, which is right here next to the campaign box. Now I'll mention, you'll see on commander cards they have a loyalty rating. That is only used in one instance in the game, which doesn't always come up. It's if a treason card gets played under a specifically narrow set of circumstances. So if you ever find yourself in a situation where treason is played, check the rules for how to use this loyalty rating. But the other thing I'll point out is that some commanders are listed as independent commanders and some are not. Independent commanders, what distinguishes them is that you can use them to get die roll modifiers on expeditions. which is a perfect segue to expedition cards. Expeditions represent smaller campaigns or campaigns which Napoleon didn't personally participate in. And they're resolved immediately during the card action phase, and you can resolve multiple expeditions in a single turn if you happen to draw more than one. You'll only ever generally resolve one campaign a turn, but expeditions, you just resolve them as they come up in the campaign, in the card action phase. You simply follow the instructions on the card, and when you're done, be sure to exhaust any independent commanders that you used in the expedition by flipping them over. They're not available for use when you do campaign resolution this turn because they're away on an expedition. Strategy and tactics cards get placed in this strategy and tactics location box, and they're another source of positive die roll modifiers when you're resolving campaigns. Unlike commanders, many of them don't cost anything to use, and you have a lot more flexibility in when you can decide when to use them during campaign resolution. Expeditions, for what it's worth, will often prohibit you from using strategy and tactics cards, but not always. And finally, there's campaign modifier cards. These get placed in the campaign modifiers location box, as you'd expect, and again, they are a source of positive and negative die roll modifiers, but they also have other effects that they can apply to the current campaign. Now, what distinguishes them from commanders and strategy and tactics cards, or one of the main things that distinguishes them, is that every year the campaign modifier cards that are in that box are discarded. Commanders and strategy and tactics cards, they stay there and are available year after year after year after year. Campaign modifier cards are only active in a year in which they're drawn during the card action phase. All of which brings us finally, inexorably, to the campaign resolution phase, where your exploits on the battlefield will determine whether you are resigned to the dustbin of history or outshine your historical counterpart. Now, I will say that when you first get started, campaign resolution can feel a little bit fiddly, but it starts to make sense pretty quickly and become second nature. And let's start with, if there is no campaign in this location box, you skip this phase pretty much entirely. You do the cleanup stuff, which mostly would involve discarding any cards in the campaign modifiers box. And this will happen occasionally. During CMD, you'll have years where you don't draw a campaign during the card action phase. During FCD, there's a couple of wars that you fight, after which Austria and Prussia tend to go sort of like neutral, and they don't change. And so once those wars are fought and they're neutral, you don't have wars to fight until you reach the Emperor phase. It can happen occasionally during the EMD as well. It just happens a lot less then, because you're really kind of focused on fighting the Napoleonic Wars during EMD. But let's say there is a campaign in that box. Well, in that case, you need to resolve that campaign, typically resulting in victory or defeat, although there are a couple of campaigns that can end in a stalemate. So I'm going to walk through all of the steps in campaign resolution and describe them. And then after that, I'm actually going to walk through an example using this Army of Italy campaign, and hopefully that will put all the pieces together for you. But before I do that, I'm going to mention that I'm going to skip one of the steps in the rules, which is the step for Spanish ulcer expeditions. During EMD, it's possible you'll find yourself embroiled in a campaign in hostile Spain like the real Napoleon. If that's the case, you resolve the Spanish ulcer expedition every year during this phase. It's resolved pretty much like every other expedition in the game, but it just keeps happening year after year after year. Check the rules for more info, but my best advice is stay out of Spain if you can. Okay, campaign resolution. Step 1, assign commanders. So you will have a set of commanders in this box, but you have to pay usually admin points to decide which commanders are actually going to accompany you on this year's campaign. The commanders cards will tell you how much and what type of resource point you have to spend in order to assign them to this campaign. You pay the cost right now just to make them available to you. You may not use them, but you don't get a refund. And most commanders can only be used for their DRM in one round of combat. So you'll want to pay attention to that and make sure you have some that can be used after the first round in case your first round of combat doesn't go the way you're hoping. But most importantly is that after this moment, you can't add more commanders to your campaign. So you gotta do the math and make your best decisions right now and make sure that you have the commanders that you want on this campaign. Okay, so now we get into actually resolving the campaign itself. Let me talk about it a little bit at a high level first before I dive into the details. At its highest level, you are going to fight a combat round each time you go through this series of steps. And during that combat round, you're going to play various cards from here, or various cards from here are going to affect a die roll modifier that you're going to have for that round of combat. Now, that die roll modifier can never be more than +4, and it can never be less than -4. So a lot of what you're doing is you are trying to get the best possible die roll modifier you can get while still leaving something in reserve in case things go wrong. Because if you suffer a stalemate result, you have to fight a second round of combat. So now I have to decide which commanders are actually going to be used during this round of combat. And I can only choose from the commanders that I've assigned to the campaign. So let's say that these are the 3 commanders that I assigned to the campaign. I paid 2 admin, I paid 2 glory, and I've got these 3 commanders available to me. Now, I'm not going to assign Murad, or I can't assign Murad because his DRM is only available in a combat round after the first. So I'm keeping him in reserve. Similarly, I'm going to keep Lons in reserve. I could use him for +1 DRM this round. I don't want to use him for his +2 because I don't want to remove him from play. But I've kind of looked ahead, and so I know that I only really need a +1 from my commander. So I'm going to assign Juno, and I flip him over to indicate that I've used him already so that I know if there's a second round of combat, I can't use him again. So next, I'm going to check strategy and tactics cards. And I've got 2 of them here. This one gives me a +3 DRM in 1 combat round per campaign, but when I use it, there's a chance that I might be killed. But I am going to use that for the +3, and this one gives me a +DRM in the first combat round of each campaign, and I'm going to use that as well. Now I'm kind of notionally out here at +5 at this point, but I have this campaign modifier card, which is where we go next, and that gives me a -1 DRM in that combat round. The other campaign modifier card I have doesn't provide any die roll modifiers, but it does have something that I have to deal with after I have resolved the campaign. So at this point, I am at my maximum of +4 DRM. Thing you're going to want to do is scan the board for any cards in hostile nation location boxes that might influence combat. So for example, if Archduke Charles is in this Austrian box, there's a -1 DRM in all combat rounds of a campaign involving Austria. Or if Prussia has the Krumper system, you treat the first victory in campaigns against Prussia as a stalemate. I've assigned my commanders, I've selected the commanders that are active in this combat round, I've looked at all the cards in the campaign modifiers, strategy and tactics boxes, and in location boxes around the map to get all of the DRMs, and I've arrived at a final DRM for the combat. Can't be higher than +4, can't be lower than -4. So at that point, I roll a die, apply the modifier, and check my result on this chart here. Now, I've been saying this all along, and you can immediately see why. Whenever possible, you want to have Napoleon's luck available right now, just in case this roll goes against you, because defeats and even stalemates can have pretty significant negative effects on your overall campaign and your overall history of Napoleon that you're writing here. So you've rolled the dice, applied the DRM, and now you've got a result on this chart. And results fall into one of 3 categories: defeat, stalemate, or victory, and they can be bloody. You can have a bloody defeat, bloody stalemate, or bloody victory. That just means that the battle had a particularly high body count. But before you get a final result, you have to make sure that there aren't any cards involved that are going to alter that result. So you can see some examples of that here. In this card, the first time you get a victory, you treat it as a stalemate instead. In essence, you're going to have to win a victory twice in order to win that campaign. This is the opposite of it in some ways. The first time you get a defeat, you can treat it as a stalemate instead. You've got this card where you treat the first time you get a non-bloody result as bloody, and then you remove the card. So if you got a non-bloody result, it turns into bloody. And then this is a campaign card, and this campaign card says you ignore the first victory result and continue the campaign. So for this campaign against Austria, Prussia, and Russia, you actually have to win 2 victories before you can win that campaign. And I will note that you can get some pretty intense reactions between cards like this if you have multiple of them that can actually take you all the way from a victory to a defeat. If you're ever confused about the order in which to play them, the general rule is that you apply the effect from enemy cards first, and then you apply cards that are more favorable to you. And after that, you have your final result: victory, defeat, or stalemate. Before we talk about those, let's talk about what it means to get a bloody result. Well, we've already talked about the domestic politics phase. So when you get a bloody result, you grab one of these tokens and you put it over here near the domestic politics table. And that way you'll know that when you get around to making that die roll, you're going to get a -1 out of it. -1 on it for every one of these tokens that's over there. No one likes a high body count. All right, so let's say you've got a victory or a defeat. For both of those, what you're going to do is you're going to check the campaign card and you're going to look for the campaign result. And it will tell you what you do in the case of a victory or in the case of a defeat. Usually this will involve gaining or losing glory, gaining or losing other resource points, placing a treaty, which, as you remember, you place face down when you place it at the end of a campaign. But check the campaign result and apply the result for victory or defeat, depending on which one occurred. I will mention that there's a very small number of campaigns in the game that can actually end in a stalemate. The Polish campaign, which actually, you can see you only conduct 1 combat round, so it's possible for this to end as a stalemate. The campaign result includes instructions on what you do in case of a stalemate result. And the historically disastrous Russia campaign, also, it has instructions for what you do for victory, stalemate, and defeat. But let's talk about what happens in the majority of cases when the campaign card doesn't allow for a stalemate result. Well, in that case, you're going to lose 2 glory immediately, and then you have to fight another round of combat. And in that round of combat, you get a -1 DRM for every stalemate that's occurred. So the first stalemate result, you fight another round of combat with a -1. If you get a second stalemate result, you fight another round of combat with a -2, and so on and so on. Stalemates, if you aren't able to get a victory soon after they occur, can snowball pretty quickly. Now, in this vein, I want to mention a key distinction. This card says to ignore the first victory result and continue the campaign. In this case, if you get a victory in the first round, you're going to have to fight a second combat round. In that case, you don't get a -1 because you didn't actually get a stalemate result, even though you have to fight a second round of combat. You only get the -1 DRM if you're fighting another round of combat because you got a stalemate result at the end of your campaign resolution. When you're fighting a second round of combat, whether that's as a result of a stalemate or something else, any commanders that you used in a previous round, any commanders that are face down, can't be used in subsequent combat rounds. So the other problem that you get as you have to fight more and more and more rounds of combat is you start to run out of positive die roll modifiers coming from your commanders. Okay, so let's just say you got a result. You got a victory in this campaign. Okay, so that's great. You only got a few steps to go with campaign resolution. The next thing you do is you roll for commander casualties. And here you're going to roll a die for every single commander who was assigned to the campaign, whether they were used or not. So in this example here, if I'd gotten a victory in my first round, I'd still be rolling for all 3 of these commanders, even though Juno was the only one that I used. And on a 1 or a 2, they're wounded and they get put in the discard pile. On any other result, you simply return them to the commander's box. How long are they wounded for? Well, you don't know, because essentially until you draw them again during the card action phase, they're out of action for you. Next up, you're going to check for campaign effects that trigger on campaign resolution, like this one. So now that the campaign is resolved, you would roll the die, and on a 1 to a 3, there would be no effect, but on a 4 through a 10, you'd get an additional 5 glory from this campaign for capturing a general. Similarly, we'd have to roll for this card, which we used, and find out Napoleon's fate. Now, there's a few campaigns who, when you check the campaign result, it tells you to immediately resolve another campaign. Well, you're going to do that right now. And this is basically exactly the same as resolving any campaign, with the exception that you skip the first 2 steps. You don't assign commanders, and you don't do the Spanish Ulcer expedition thing, which I talked about. Basically, you have the commanders available to you that you assigned to the first campaign, but you get to flip them face up so they're back available. Again, it doesn't happen often, but when it does, just know that you can't assign any new commanders to that second campaign that you're resolving. And wounded commanders aren't available either. Okay, so you're basically done. The last thing you're going to do here is just a cleanup step. So you put all of the commanders who were assigned to the campaign but weren't wounded back in the commander's box. You check the campaign. If it's got a remove when played icon on it, then you remove it. Otherwise, you would put it back in the potential campaigns area. Basically, most of the campaigns during EMD always go back to the potential campaigns area. There's a few that don't. But every other campaign in the game pretty much is remove when played. You would make all the cards in the strategy and tactics box stay, and all the cards in the campaign modifiers box, you check to see if they have a remove when played symbol. So this one, which we played, would get removed, but any of the remaining ones would go back to the discard pile. So it's really important to note that at the end of a campaign, you'll still have commanders. You'll generally still have strategy and tactics cards, but the campaign box and the campaign modifiers box will be empty. So let me walk through this and we'll show you how it all plays out in practice, and we'll see what kind of a result we get. So we kind of already talked through a little bit of this. So I'm going to assign Juno, and I'm going to assign Lans, and I'm going to assign Murad. So the sum total of this is I need to pay 2 admin and 2 glory. So I only have 2 admin available. I spend them both, and I'm going to spend the 2 glory in order to assign Murad. Okay, so now I got to figure out DRMs. So we already kind of talked this through, but I'm going to assign Juno to command. That gives me a +1 DRM. I know that I've got a -1 DRM because of the enemy guns. I've got a +1 DRM for maneuver sur les derrières, sorry for my French, and I've got +3 for Bonaparte leads, giving me a total of a +4 DRM on this first round of combat. So over here I come, and I roll the die. Oof, I almost had a 1 there, but I actually ended up with a 7. So 7 + 4 is an 11, so that's a victory. In this case, I don't have any cards which are going to modify that result, so I would go to my Army of Italy campaign, look for the results under victory, +5G and +1P. Or I can play the Treaty of Campo Formio, which is what I'll do. So I would find the Treaty of Campo Formio over here in the potential treaties area. And it says it may be played following victory in Army of Italy for +10G and -1P, and then I would remove this card from play. So I remove that card from play, just throw it over there, and I would get +10G, and I don't have any P available, so in this case, even though I lose 1, you can't go below 0, so I wouldn't lose any. Okay, so we got a couple more things that we still need to do. We need to roll for this card. So I'm going to roll. And on a 9, I get +5G. So for capturing a general, I am all the way up to 18 glory. But then I have to check and see what happens with Napoleon Bonaparte. And here I rolled a 3, so actually I'm wounded, which adds to my fame, which gives me another 5G, and I'm up to 23G. You can see, however, that while this card is in the game, you have about a 20% chance of dying in combat, so often you'll want to have Napoleon's luck around for that. But let's go back. I mean, let's think about what would have happened if I had actually rolled a 1 instead of rolling a 7 on that combat roll. Stay where you are. Thank you. So if I'd rolled a 1, that would have actually turned into a stalemate result. And at that point, I have a couple of options. I can use Napoleon's luck to re-roll that right then. I'd be fighting that without Juno available, and I wouldn't be able to use this card again because I can only use it in one combat round. And I'd have a -1 DRM, so I'd be fighting it at quite a bit of a disadvantage. So odds are, if I had rolled that 1, I'd spend Napoleon's luck, and I'd see if I could re-roll that and get a victory instead of a stalemate. So with that, hopefully you're able to understand I, Napoleon, and you can start playing. Up next, I'm going to do an example of play, and hopefully by seeing how all of it plays out in practice, it'll make more sense than it probably does right now. I will mention that I think this is a game that you have to afford some time, and you have to take on its own terms. I was between jobs when this was playtesting, and as a result, I played it a lot as part of the playtest. And my initial impressions weren't that favorable. My initial impressions were that the game was kind of playing itself, and I wasn't really sure that what I was doing made much of a difference. And sometimes the game does just make things happen, and you feel sort of hard done by. I mean, the game can't always end early on a piece of bad luck. It just can't. You have to accept that. General Napoleon could have taken a stray bullet, or one of his earliest campaigns could have gone disastrously wrong, and he wouldn't have become the figure that he did. And the game models that possibility, and it may happen to you. Admittedly, when it happens, it's usually as a result of a die roll, and you have to accept that you used Napoleon's luck early, or you could have re-rolled that, so it's at least a little bit your fault. But what I can tell you is that when I play the game now, I'm usually able to strongly influence the outcome. It took time to learn the cards and to understand the most important dynamics and how to manipulate them. And I still lose early on occasion. It happens. But I usually get deep into the game these days. In some sense, this is a game that I think is kind of tailor-made for a digital version like Tabletop Simulator. And the reason I say that is because when events do go against you, you can just reload and start playing again immediately. You don't have to take the time to reset the board up, reset the deck up, or any of that. You just kind of like reload and off you go again. And so the cost of losing and the cost of overcoming that learning curve is a little bit lower to some degree, I think, on the digital version. Well, hopefully you enjoyed this video and its companion and learning how to play I, Napoleon. If you did, it would be fantastic if you could drop a like on the video. If you're enjoying the channel or interested in what we're doing here, it'd be great if you could subscribe and hit the notification bell. All of those things really help the channel, and certainly sharing the video helps it as well. But we will see you next time on Agility Snips Gaming Table.